Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. Really, sincerely, I'm really happy that Quincy's going to give the talk, and I'm happy that there are people out there ready to hear it. And I think one of my couple things I'd thought to say. One is I heard a quote I heard from the historian Howard Zinn that wrote People's History of the United States, and he said that history was such a fascinating subject that it's easy to dive in and never get out. And I think that that's an important, and there's a book by Nietzsche called Uses and Abuses of History that's something to that effect. There, like that you can go way wrong and get way lost. So one of the things I know that when somebody is a historian, it means they're actively looking at what happened in the past. And it doesn't mean somebody that maybe has a degree in history or somebody who's a history teacher. It's somebody who's looking at the past. And I think that Quincy's a good person for all that, because he looks at the past all the time and reads books about, and talks to people about what's going on. So I'm interested to hear what's going on, and I know that Quincy can introduce himself. But we've had great people here in the past giving talks, including Joel Covell and Fred Ho, who are friends of Quincy's. So I'm really honored by this. This is happening here in the Pleasant Street Bookstore, and thank you, Woodstock Community TV, for spreading this information and talk beyond this room. And thank you. Hey, Quincy Saul.
All right. Well, thank you. There's more people came than I expected. I was ready to give this talk to just a couple people as an opportunity to share the information. And the irony is not lost on me that I'm the youngest person in the room giving a talk about history. Oh, sorry. Yep. Okay. The future is coming in the door here. But having the TV here helps frame it, because we could potentially be talking to who knows. I've been reading about, I was born here, then I left for a long time, I came back, and for about the last 10 years I've been reading a lot about Vermont, and that's what I'm going to be sharing with you today. I'm an amateur historian, so I don't have a degree. I didn't do original archival research. I've obviously talked to people my whole life, but no original oral history projects. There are some heavy hitters in the room tonight, so I feel a little nervous, but that's a good challenge. Thank you. And it's tempting to tell you more about my story, but you came to hear about Vermont, so I'm really just going to dive in. I have a lot of information I want to get through, and I apologize in advance for the format of this just being, I basically prepared a lecture. But with that said, if you can possibly hang on into the end, I would love to have a discussion, and informal or formal. The only thing, I'm just going to try to summarize my own perspective on this and who I am. I'm just going to read a short poem by T.S. Eliot, who said, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." So why do we care about history? I feel like we should say this, because I certainly wasn't told in elementary school. It was just like, you just have to learn this. No real choice. But why should we care? I would say sort of three reasons. One is what Wes Jackson and Gary Snyder called becoming native to this place. It's like knowing where you are. And no matter how much of an individual or how original you think you may be, you're part of a story. And the sooner you can figure that out, the more you can make a real contribution. The second one is because this history is endangered. There's a national trust for historic preservation in 2004. They designated the entire state of Vermont as one of America's 11 most endangered historical places. It was the second time the state was put on the list. So it's important to get this information out there while we still can. And the third reason, it's a sort of a metaphor, I think it is important, why have history, is a running start. Think of it like a running start. We're right now on the verge of total social ecological cataclysm across the planet, and we have to take a leap. And if we need to leap, we better have a good running start. 10,000 years, that's where we're going to start today. So I'm going to show you, this will help. This is like my cheap art visual aid here. because power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. Um, so this is just to help us frame our chronology of the presentation today. And there's no X or Y axis in the sense like the top is not, it's not like a peak or a trough. Basically, this is just a way to illustrate that this land where we are right now, Dakina or Dawnland, has been inhabited for about 10,000 years. But the part of the story, usually when we talk about history, we're really just starting here, pretty much. It's about 1609. That's sort of where like Vermont history starts for this European civilization that we all descend from in this language. So this is sort of a framework for how I think sometimes we sort of think that this is history, but hopefully this diagram, there should be even more lines here, shows how long people have been here. And so there's going to be a few chapters here. I'm going to talk a little bit about Dawnland, the original 10,000 years, the majority of the human history of what we now call Vermont. Then we're going to talk about the fur trade, what we call the fur trade, which was actually part of a world war. Then we're going to talk about what's called, what people often call the Vermont Republic, or the state of Vermont, which was 1777 to 1791, brief period of time when Vermont was an independent state. We're going to talk about Vermont versus slavery, which culminated in the Civil War. Then we're going to talk about the robber barons, which is starting around 1880s and goes up to today. I'd argue we're still in the age of the robber barons today. So with that said, we'll get started. Thanks for being here, everybody. Okay, so about 20,000 years ago, this is all under a whole lot of ice, Laurentide ice sheet. It's about 20,000 feet thick. And it was so heavy that it depressed the current level of land over 3,000 feet below where sea level is today. And also we're talking high up too, because this is the Appalachians were the size of the Himalaya. So anyway, this piece of land goes back a long way. Between 16 and 12,000 years ago, the land it starts to melt. Different theories about that. So as soon as things start to melt, plants arrive. We've got black spruce, paper birch, poplar. I won't give you all the details, but some of the megafauna, there was mastodon, moose elk, caribou, giant beaver, short-faced bear, wolverines. One fun thing from this period is that as this ice cap was melting, it became a sea, what was the Champlain Sea, what's now Lake Champlain. At its height, it was 20,000 square miles. And that started to drain between around 8,000 to 7,000 BC. By 6,000 BC, the ice is gone. In that lake, by the way, in that sea, Champlain Sea, there were whales, seals, porpoises. And then once the ice is gone around 6,000 BC, then the trees and animals that we have here today, some of them start to come in, like pine and oak, alders, ash, acorns, etc., otters, turkey. And then roughly 10,000 BC, people start to show up in the archaeological record as soon as there's no more ice. And I'm not going to try to tell you too much about it, the details of that. But that's sort of the geological history of the creations, one way to tell the creation story of Vermont. But there's another way to tell the creation story of Vermont. It's a much older way, which is to say that, if you'll excuse my pronunciations, Tabaldak, who was the owner or the creator, androgynous owner-creator, created everything. Except for one thing, which was Odzihozo, who was the transformer who created himself from dust and created the whole world. And the last place Odzihozo created in the whole world was Lake Champlain. And it was his masterpiece creation. At the end, he transformed himself into a rock, which we now call, I think, Rock Dunder. It's a little rock in the middle of Lake Champlain. And he sat there to observe creation. And then there was, we should bring up Gluskap or Gluskabe, who was sort of the original culture hero, maybe the equivalent of Prometheus in European history, or Manu in Indian history. In Africa, maybe Anansi or Viracocha in South America, or Quetzalcoatl. He was sort of the one who brought tools, fought the ice giants famously. In one of the stories, he meets a whale. So I think it's important to bring this in because mythology is not like a folk tale for children. Mythology encodes social and ecological history. And there's a way in which the disciplines of biology and geology are actually recapitulated and told inside mythology. And we should take that seriously. The last thing I'll say, I wasn't going to bring this up, but because there's some controversy and I don't know the answer, but the question of the stone chambers. And I wasn't going to say anything, but in the last Vermont Standard, the local historian authority, Howard Coffin, broached the subject and is quoted in the last Vermont Standards saying it's an obituary for a local historian, Jeanette Sawyer in Bridgewater, talking about these ancient stone structures and chambers in Vermont. There's one in South Woodstock, which he says may offer evidence that Europeans, Africans, and Asians visited America at least 3,000 years before Columbus. So my dad has had some funky books in his store alleging that for a long time, but now it's sort of, even someone like Howard Coffin is ready to discuss it. The only thing we have to add to that, that a lot of native historians have been saying for a really long time, I think in the 70s, Vine Deloria he challenged the Bering Strait hypothesis and said we got to turn the footprints around. Actually, maybe people came from here and went to there. And it makes a lot more sense if you think about the Gulf Stream. Be way easier to float to Europe, to travel east, than to go against the Gulf Stream and come all the way here. So there are reasons to think that maybe the Druids built their stone chambers in Scotland based on the models from here. But with that said, this is speculation. We'll move on. So right now we are in Penobagos, the freezing moon. There's so much to say about the native history, and there's many native scholars. You should really just read them yourselves about this part of the world. I'm just going to read a quote, which I think goes over a lot of the reason I'm choosing this quote is it describes, and there's different ways to pronounce this. There's Abenaki. I'm not here to police. I don't know probably they're all wrong. Other people can correct me on this, but this is a little capture of the way of life, which I think is worth quoting just in the sense that it compares to our own way of life in some obvious ways. The Abenaki society attached great importance to sharing, generosity, and hospitality. These virtues could mean the difference between eating and going hungry. In good times or bad, the family band ate communal meals, and no one went hungry while his neighbor feasted. The young Abenaki growing up in this society were taught that concern for others should always be shown, and that a selfish person was of no use to the community. Hunters won as much admiration for their generosity as for their skill with the bow and arrow. Children treated their elders with great respect, and elders showed kindness to the children. Adults preferred teaching to punishment. The young learned from their parents, aunts, and uncles, and other elders. They drank in the wisdom of the tales they heard around winter hearth fires. The elected chief held their position for life, but had limited authority and could be deposed if they behaved badly or if there was misfortune under their leadership. And when a major decision was made, all the members, men, women, and even children, had the chance to speak in the council. That's from Colin Calloway's book, The Abenaki, and I think those are just important to reflect upon because we live in a society which is mostly the opposite way of going about things. But we're learning. Okay, so that's a brief history of the last 10,000 years. Please excuse me, that's the biggest part of this story, and I would just encourage you, I have a bibliography to refer to the native historians themselves and the other professionals to give you more information about that way of life, which there is sort of a myth that even when I was growing up, that people didn't live in Vermont, that this was empty land. It's a little bit like a land without people for a people without land. We've heard that before, right? But it's not true. And now the archaeological record and the oral tradition is clear. So, 1609, Samuel Champlain shows up in Lake Champlain with Abenaki guides and shoots an Iroquois. Don't really know the details of that, but that's where basically we can say when war comes to Dawnland. Why was he here? Fur trade. They came for skins, mostly beaver, but also deer, ermine, skunk, and bear. So the French were in Canada and the British were in New England, and this intensified whatever existing intertribal conflict there may have been. The fur trade peaks in the 1650s. Competition escalates into catastrophe. What started as a war on nature became a war on people, a war that lasted a century. Dawnland became a battlefield and a proxy war between France and England. Europeans call this the French-Indian War or the 7 Years' War, but neither name is quite right. Winston Churchill called it the First World War. It lasted a century. European soldiers and merchants made war in North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, India, and the Philippines. Bob Bearer in the Vermont movie says it was a war for an empire and it changed the fate of the world. So the first buildings in Vermont were in this context: Fort St. Anne in 1666 in Isle La Motte, abandoned shortly after. And then the first permanent white settlement, which was is now Brattleboro, was Fort Dummer was built there in 1741. And they built that to fight against the never defeated indigenous military leader named Greylock. Greylock is important to mention. He was Waranoke, we think. He united the Abenaki and Algonquin tribes to fight against the French and the English. They fought in Canada, Vermont, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, and was never caught or defeated. And the tallest mountain in the Berkshires is named after him, Mount Greylock. That's Nathaniel Hawthorne talks about Greylock Mountain. Also, Thoreau had his sort of revelation. He spent the night on Mount Greylock and woke up. He knew what he wanted to do with his life. So it's an important piece of local history. As we can see, there's a lot of people here who know more than I do on these subjects. Thank you for your patience. So another thing to talk about in this period are the captivity narratives. Just to jump right into it, in this 100-year period of conflict between, French, Canadians, British colonists, and the different local indigenous peoples, in 1704, there was a raid, Indian raid on Deerfield, which took 119 prisoners. And there's, just to pick one part of that story, the Reverend John Williams wrote a narrative. His daughter Eunice decided never to return home and live with the tribe. So this is something you find throughout New England history, is that in this period there was often captives taken, and they would try to take the native kids and raise them European, and take the European kids and raise them native. And I think one of the better statements on this subject was made by Benjamin Franklin. I'm going to read you a nice little-known quote from Benjamin Franklin. "When an Indian child has been brought up among us, taught our language and habituated to our customs, yet if he goes to see his relations and make one Indian ramble with them, there is no persuading him ever to return. But when white persons of either sex have been taken prisoners by the Indians and lived a while among them, though ransomed by their friends and treated with all imaginable tenderness to prevail with them to stay among the English, yet in a short time they become disgusted with our manner of life, and the care and pains that are necessary to support it, and take the first opportunity of escaping again into the woods, from whence there is no reclaiming them." There's a great novel about this in the Vermont context by Joseph Bruchac, maybe one of the most important local native authors, called The Winter People, which goes into this in detail. And it's a little known part of American history, is that a lot of the European descendants who came here, some of them directly off the boat, decided to join a different civilization that they saw as superior. And this was a huge threat. And this started right at the Plymouth Plantation. But this is a little Vermont piece of the story. We don't want to underestimate completely the role of disease. There were outbreaks, 1616, 1639, killed many natives. But we don't lose sight of the fact that it was also an orchestrated genocidal project, which is ongoing. In 1763, the war ends. They sign the Treaty of Paris. The war is over. And this sort of sets the stage for the colonization of Vermont, because it was a war zone up until that time. But after 1763, settlers start to come in. Over the next dozen years, about 12,000 people come into the area known as the New Hampshire Grants. And when the borders come in, the different native groups are split up and lost on different sides of those borders. So thus began the settlement of what we now call Vermont, but you wouldn't recognize it. There was no grass. We're talking about 1,000-year-old oaks, 500-year-old pines. I mean, there were meadows, there were parts that were cut by the natives to, there was ecosystem management, but it really didn't look much like this. And you probably might not recognize some of the European settlers either, because they were slightly different stock than many of the ones who settled in the fertile river valleys of what we call New England. One thing to say is many of them came on foot. There's no other way in. Many could not afford horses. They were mostly not super wealthy settlers. There were no roads, and the only rivers were small and interrupted by waterfalls, so we could only really travel them by canoe. No fancy aristocrats and almost no clergy. There's stories about kids, they wrap straw around the feet instead of shoes. So now we'll look at the map here. So what's this setting up to look like? So these are lines in the sand, obviously, but just to give you an idea. The green is in Vermont here. So to the west, we've got the colony of New York, which is a plantation economy in the very fertile river valley, founded on Dutch mercantilism and indentured servitude. To the south, we have colony of Massachusetts, also a plantation economy, really massive fertile river valleys, controlled by very strict Puritan culture, mostly governed by the church. To the east, we've got New Hampshire, which was mostly wilderness, but it's got a seaport, and that made it way more connected to the global economy. So there's timber barons and big colonial merchants getting set up in New Hampshire. And to the north, we have St. Francis or Odanak. We've got Montreal, the center of the Wabanaki Confederacy, later a French mission, finally a British colony, all brought together by the fur trade. And in the center, we have here the first settlers of what would become Vermont. And in the beginning, it was a subsistence economy of small freeholders without really any professionals, producing mostly for local use in the beginning. Okay, so first town, 1750, named Bennington, after Benning Wentworth, same guy who chartered Woodstock. He got rich selling the war-torn, depopulated lands of the Wabanaki Confederacy to European settlers in the name of the king. And there was major land speculation. In 1769, there were 128 towns in Vermont, and only 51 of them had residents. And meanwhile, in New York, the governor of New York was also offering land grants for the same land, both by the kings. So, nice work if you can get it. Big land speculators. So the early colonial history of Vermont is a mess. It's tons of competing land claims, and even centuries later, people are still arguing about, who owned what, and the loyalists, or et cetera, et cetera. Big land speculators on both sides, but I've read people. It seems like there's a difference between a lot of the people who came from the New York grants and the New Hampshire grants. What's the difference? There's some, it's a big period of history, but in general, many of the settlers who moved into land claimed by New York were tenants, whereas people who moved into the New Hampshire grant land were owners of the land. So eventually, the governors of New York and New Hampshire took the claims to court to be settled by the King of England. And in 1770, across the Atlantic, the king decides and sides with New York. So suddenly, hundreds of people lose the ownership of their farms that they were on for, maybe one generation or something like that. So this all sort of culminates in Albany. Dr. Kemp, who was the king's attorney, advised that the people settled on the New Hampshire grants should make the best terms possible with their landlords. And Ethan Allen famously replied, "The gods of the hills, gods of the valleys are not the gods of the hills." This is a sort of weighty moment in early Vermont history. What does that mean? He basically was saying, we're not going to recognize this court. Years go by, sort of things are hard to tell what's going to happen. 1775, March 13th, it sort of finally boils over in Westminster. And there's a conflict between the New York landlords and the small farmers. Everybody's kind of a small farmer, between the New York landlords and the land grants from New Hampshire. And basically there's a sheriff, they decide in favor of New York, and a sheriff's posse, there's a big crowd of farmers come, and the sheriff, we'll get up to there. So we're still in 1770, but we'll get to the Civil War. Yeah. Okay, no, we're still in that period. So the Westminster Massacre, because basically the police that were hired fired into the crowd. And suddenly there were two sides. It's like either you're with the New Yorkers or you're with the Hampshire Grant people. At this time, the War of Independence from England was just starting. but it wasn't really clear whose side to choose. And these small farmers are caught in the crosshairs of geopolitics. And into that sort of moment comes the Allen brothers. There's Ethan, Ira, Levi, and Ebenezer, among others. For decades, they'd been surveying, farming, speculating, hunting in the Green Mountains, and they knew the land pretty well. They were the founders of the Green Mountain Boys, and for the last 5 years, they'd been resisting New York's land claims. They've been described, they were called the Bennington Mob by Albany. But they were, Vrest Orton, who started the Vermont Country Store, he has a colorful thing to say about this. He says, it was not an ignorant mob. It was composed of farmers who at a minute's notice would grab flint and lock musket ready for action when and where Ethan called. The choice of commanding officer was made by the men doing the fighting. And from the autumn of 1770, there was no want of fighting, but it was the strangest kind of fighting an army had ever known. In 5 years of the conflict, not one man was killed, no one was seriously injured, and little blood was shed. So, I don't know, some people claim that the Green Mountain Boys learned guerrilla tactics from the Native Americans. I don't really know if that's true or not, but you can say that there wasn't much guerrilla action like this happening in other parts of early American history. And they would do things like public humiliation, like they would take somebody and set up a mobile court. There was a guy named Sam Adams. I don't know if he's the same Boston Sam Adams, but for instance, they tied him up and put him in a chair and hung him up outside the tavern and told him to sin no more. And they used this kind of mechanism to settle early disputes. So, according to some people, they were a mob, they were terrorists. For others, they were freedom fighters. Dispute goes on to this day. They met in bars and in hilltops and in caves. They fought hard and they drank harder. What's this guy's name? The Contrary Country, Ralph Nading Hill, he says, probably no men in New England's history had as much fun as the young leaders of young Vermont. And Ethan Allen says, his detractors and his fans would agree with this. He says, probably we are the most selfish, oddest, and cunningest medley of beings of our size in the universe. So May 10th, 1775, this really enters everybody's attention. The Green Mountain Boys surprised the world with their most famous exploit by capturing the largest British fort in North America, which is Fort Ticonderoga. It's right around here, without a single shot fired. It was the biggest asset on the continent, full of weapons. The strongest military in the world was outwitted and captured overnight by a ragtag militia, which, as their commander said, lacked almost every necessary courage accepted. Those were Ethan Allen's words. The guns and ammunition captured at Fort Ticonderoga, and shortly after at Crown Point, were taken south to Boston. The cannons from Ticonderoga were put over the Boston harbor, and the British fleet never came back. So it's a really key period of the whole what we call the Revolutionary War, or War of Independence. It's also important to say this came just a couple months after the shot heard around the world at Lexington and Concord, which was a defensive military action. So this was the first offensive action of the War of Independence. And it made Ethan Allen a hero, but in the newly founded Continental Congress, it made Vermont more enemies than friends. So many at this time still wanted peace with England. And even the ones who supported self-defense in Lexington and Concord weren't for revolution, but capturing Fort Ticonderoga forced everybody's hands. So New York was the wealthiest of the 13 colonies, and they had most weight in the Continental Congress. And Massachusetts and New Hampshire also claimed Vermont, which at that time was not, as the New Hampshire grants. So denied statehood, surrounded by people who denied their titles, they declared independence. Whenever protection is withheld, no allegiance is due or can of right be demanded. With those words, on January 15th, 1777, representatives of the Green Mountains met in Westminster again and declared independence. The name Vermont was chosen by Thomas Young, friend of Ethan Allen. But having claimed the biggest victory in the war against the British so far, no good deed went unpunished. The Vermont, they were basically punished for this action and were not given, weren't allowed in to join they weren't allowed to be the 14th state. So Ira Allen said Congress would rather crush Vermont than lose the friendship of New York. And he said, "The stone which the builders rejected became the head of the corner to the honor of the Green Mountain Boys." So on July 22nd in 1777, they gathered in a tavern, as they usually did, in Windsor. And at that time, the British governor Burgoyne was coming down from the north. He had just recaptured Ticonderoga. They lost it. They weren't able to defend it. And just after this news reached them in the tavern, a storm came. So with thunder and lightning outside and the British army approaching to the north and a continental army to the south, which marched to the tune of New York money, they stayed up all night and wrote the Constitution of the state of Vermont. And in 1777, I don't know how you could argue it, I think it was the most radical document in the English-speaking world. Just a few highlights of the first Vermont Constitution. Declared all colonial charters void. No European precedent, no lawyers. No property restrictions on franchise. So still only men could vote but didn't have to own property. Slavery was declared unconstitutional and abolished. There were no taxes, and there wasn't much of a government to support. But also, what expenses they had, they made by expropriating land from loyalists. They applied to join, but New York was like, no, that's ours. And New Hampshire is like, no, that's ours. And Massachusetts is like, no, that's ours. So
after they wrote the Vermont Constitution, there was a big response from them?
So yeah, well, let's get to there. They had a school for every town in the Constitution, provisions for debt relief via barter, and a unicameral legislature. I don't know, people haven't made much point of this, but in order to eliminate lawyers and professional bureaucrats, there was no distinction between legislative, judicial, and executive branches. So whoever wrote laws were expected to implement and enforce them as well. And that's over a century before that was also done by the Paris Commune, which is more familiar to sort of Marxist historians and that kind of thing, but not talked about much in Vermont. So these guys wrote this, but then it was ratified at the Windsor Convention later that month, and not a single college graduate was in attendance. The Constitution of the new republic, or state, did not endear Vermont to the Continental Congress. New York feared its radical ideas about property. Massachusetts worried about its anti-Puritan leadership. Virginia despised its emancipators and their anti-slavery doctrines, and George Washington was afraid of its militias, and there were a lot of deserters in Vermont as well. So the elites and the elite in general, from just a class analysis, the elites in all the colonies were haunted by the specter of these uneducated poor farmers who seized political power. And Washington's worry about Vermont was not idle. In the 1780s, after Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, 100 rebels sought refuge in Vermont and even offered Ethan Allen command of their Revolutionary Army. He did not accept that, but it would have been interesting to counterfactual history what would have happened. As early as 1779, with the Vermont Republic only 2 years old, there are already competing claims for Vermont from New Hampshire, New York, and Massachusetts. In January 1781, New Hampshire Council votes to annihilate the existence of Vermont. How do they respond? I'll read 3 quotes from the Allen brothers, who are sort of the intellectual leadership of this period of history in Vermont. Ethan Allen says, "I am as resolutely determined to defend the independence of Vermont as Congress is that of the United States, and rather than fail, will retire with hardy Green Mountain boys into the desolate caverns of the mountains and wage war with human nature at large." His brother, Levi Allen, says, "Next year, if something is not done, I will retire to the Green Mountains and defend myself as the brave Negroes do in certain mountainous islands in the West Indies." So that was 1 year after the Vermont legislature abolished slavery, and just a few years before the outbreak of the Haitian Revolution, to which Levi was referring. So then Ira Allen, who's sort of the more measured intellectual of the brothers, said, "Surrounded on every side, with numbers were small, without affluence, and in a perilous situation, necessity, the mother of invention, instituted policy in place of power." So I'm not going to get into this in too much detail, even though it's interesting, but this begins what's called the Haldimand affair. And historians still argue about this. But basically, for a few years, there was this orchestrated letter writing campaign, and only a few people knew about it. There's like 8 or 9 people in Vermont even knew this secret plan, and it was a big risk, because what they did, everybody was threatening to invade them. So they wrote letters to the British general and said, "We're thinking of joining you. We're not. The Continental Congress doesn't want us. We'll join you." But like, what are the terms? So they start this negotiation, and it's like a double. It was a double feint. That's how my reading of it is. It forced the hand of the Continental Congress, saying, "Okay, what are you going to do, guys? You want us or not?" And in the meantime, it prevented the British general from invading. But with that said, like, historians still argue, you can read pages in the Vermont Encyclopedia about this. Some people think that that the Allen brothers are total traitors because there's letters saying, like, we'll join Britain. So people still argue about that. In general, I think and just to say, in terms of the outcome, the conspiracy was a success. The British were defeated before Burgoyne could invade Vermont, and the Continental Congress admitted Vermont against the protests of New York and the other colonies. Their big enemies in Congress were the Federalists. They didn't like Vermont's independence, the decentralized government made up of farmers who own their own land. But eventually they decided, let's give them what they want rather than risk that the example spreads. Alexander Hamilton said, it's time to put an end to the Vermont principle. And so a handful of Vermonters who never went to college outmaneuvered a British general in Canada and a legion of continental elites who were gathered in Philadelphia to divvy up the spoils of the old empire. In 1791, Vermont joined the United States. The same year they carried out their first census, which said, "To the honor of humanity, no slaves." Okay, trying to go through this quickly, guys, but I'm going too slowly.
No, it's good.
Okay. I have a lot of stuff to get through here, but if we don't finish, that's all right. So next period is I'm going to go into here is Civil War, but I'm going to sort of frame it, give it a longer framework. Vermont versus slavery. The first Emancipation Proclamation in the Americas was written in 1777, 100 years before the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which abolished slavery in the United States. When the Green Mountain Boys captured Fort Ticonderoga, there were 2 enslaved Africans, Dinah Mattis and her daughter Nancy, both property of a British officer. Commanding Officer Ebenezer Allen, I'm quoting a local historian here, who wrote a whole book about this subject, this particular incident. They hand-wrote an emancipation statement, recorded it at the Bennington Town Clerk's office, and set them free. And this is sort of the first incident of a white man publicly emancipating somebody enslaved on paper in the United States. But Ebenezer was not alone. There's a record of 2 black members of the Green Mountain Boys. So it wasn't the white man freeing the blacks. There were black people involved in taking Fort Ticonderoga. Also making this the first integrated military, semi-formal military, if we're not counting like Great Dismal Swamp and other things like that, by almost a century. And so begins the story of Vermont versus slavery. This would last a century. So 1777, the Vermont Constitution denied anyone the right to own slaves. In 1786, the legislature passed an act fining persons guilty of selling or removing Negroes from the state, requiring that the fine be paid to the Negroes in question. In 1793, there is a nice case of Judge Theophilus Harrington in Middlebury. He was asked to preside over a case of 2 fugitive slaves. And the prosecution said, here's the document which would say that we're the owners. And he asked, can you please give me a bill of sale from God Almighty? And they were unable to produce this document, and so they were set free. In 1830, there was a public confrontation in Poultney where some slave catchers tried to show up and grab somebody, and they surrounded the slave catcher and threw him out of town. In 1833 was the first anti-slavery society in Vermont in the town of Jamaica, but that was just the beginning. There were 20 similar organizations throughout the state only pretty shortly afterwards. And there's a lot of famous speakers who came through here, like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, Wendell Phillips, Cassius Clay, many more. Garrison wrote, he's one of the most famous abolitionists. He wrote that about Vermonters, he said, a more hardy, individual, frank, generous race does not exist. 1838, Vermont legislature votes to deny statehood to slave states. 1843, Vermont forbids the detention of fugitive slaves. 1846, so this is important history, the Mexican War. Vermont opposed it, but participated. There are a lot of very eloquent speeches you can read in the Vermont legislature of people opposing the Mexican War, which we usually don't think about having to do with slavery, but it's just bad history teachers. Mexico had abolished slavery. So suddenly we think about the Alamo a little differently. Wait a minute. Remember the Alamo? Which side were, anyway, do your own research there. But in the same way that there was a Southern Underground Railroad. It's just, they know about this more in that part of the world. We don't talk about it much in New England. But there were many thousands of people who took a Southern Underground Railroad to Mexico. And, that's why Thoreau went to jail. That's why he decided to stop paying taxes, was because of the Mexican-American War. And, George Perkins Marsh, I'll say more about him later. He also was very eloquent in his opposition to it. So keep going here. 1856, Vermont legislator sends $20,000 for the settlement of Kansas, which was a free state. And the other states did not like this. I'll quote from Ralph Nading Hill's book, Contrary Country. In Georgia, the assembly lawmakers resolved that the governor of that state submit to the governor of Vermont a pro-slavery resolution enclosed in a lead bullet, together with a coil or rope and some gunpowder. And he also requested that His Excellency President Pierce be requested to employ a sufficient number of able-bodied Irishmen to proceed to the state of Vermont, dig a ditch around the limits of the same, and float the thing into the Atlantic. 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court rules in the Dred Scott decision that blacks are not citizens and cannot legally win freedom. And in response, the next year in 1858, the Vermont legislature freed all blacks living in the state. So now we're getting into the Underground Railroad. It's estimated that around 4,000 people passed through Vermont on their way to Canada between the 1820s and the 1860s. Howard Coffin writes in his book Full Duty, drive north along Route 5 from Brattleboro to Norwich, up Route 7 from Bennington all the way to Swanton, or up winding Route 106 from Springfield to Woodstock, and one goes the way. That was sort of one of the main paths of the Underground Railroad coming through here. So, why was it underground? If Vermont was so great and everybody was anti-slavery, why do they have to hide? So it turns out it's a little more complicated. In the 1760s, it goes way back. There's a record of a black family in Guilford getting driven away. I think there might even be an incident in Woodstock where this happened. It's sort of a mob thing, and they just harass the family until they leave. Frederick Douglass, we'll just quote him. He says, on the whole, the several towns visited showed that Vermont was surprisingly under the influence of the slave power. Her proud boast that within her borders no slave had ever been delivered up to his master did not hinder her hatred to anti-slavery. 1835, there was a fight in the Vermont legislature over an anti-slavery speech by Reverend Samuel May, which culminated in a riot in Montpelier. Posters were put up to boycott his talk. A mob threw eggs and at the windows while he was talking. Many of the anti-slavery societies were what was known as colonization societies. So they were against slavery, but it was because they were against black people being anywhere near them. So they wanted to ship all the Africans back to Africa, and they were opposed for slavery for a different reason than you might think, here in the 21st century anyway. The struggle continues. We're eventually going to get up to the present day, but I'll just say that even after the Civil War, the Ku Klux Klan had claimed thousands of members in Vermont, organized large rallies in Montpelier and East Barre in the 1920s. There's some photographs of those rallies. Minstrel shows were very popular at the UVM. It was like the big event of the year, and the last was very recent. 1969 was the last one they did. A couple other things to mention about this. Delia Webster, really another local hero from Virgins. She was the first woman imprisoned for aiding a fugitive slave family. She was helping Lewis and Harriet Hayden. Lewis Hayden ultimately wound up with John Brown, which is an interesting Vermont story. Another one, Alexander Twilight, another local African-American hero, first African-American to earn a college degree from Middlebury. He also joined the Vermont legislature in 1836. He was the first African-American legislator in Vermont by over 100 years. Okay, 1861, Civil War starts. President Lincoln asks Vermont to join the Army. Everybody agrees. They vote for a huge sum, massive response. But there's a nice story about this. Once they all agreed, everyone was asked to sing the national anthem, and nobody knew the words. Which is like interesting. I think that says a lot. Like they wanted to fight against slavery. They wanted to fight, but it wasn't some like patriotism. They didn't know the national anthem. So I don't know. I mean, we can read that your own ways. I just think it's an important little piece of history. You know, there's so much written about Vermont's role in the Civil War, and local historians have done it better than I ever will. Vermont, had huge sacrifice. 34,000 people were sent. Over 5,000 died. Even the people and then the people who didn't go, there was massive. The whole state organized boycotts. They were producing. It was sort of the biggest unity period in all Vermont history. Everybody coordinated, working together. They spent more than like the whole previous history of Vermont on supporting the war. And even in the battle, in Gettysburg, the famous fire on the right was from Vermont troops. Vermont General George Stannard, who was the first to enlist, was the first over the hill in the last battle. Also, the Vermont hospital commissioners did a pretty good job setting out commissioners to look after Vermonters in the Civil War hospitals. Vermonters were also, my colleague in Bucknell University, Dr. Ben Barson, pointed this out to me. Even in Reconstruction, there was a Vermonter named John Phelps, even after the Civil War. This is very far away, not during the Civil War, in New Orleans, very far away. Vermont General John Phelps sort of overrid his previous in command, Benjamin Butler, and started training black troops in use of weapons. So the beginning of the Civil War, that was totally prohibited. Was not allowed. It was only towards the end of the war that blacks began to fight were given weapons when they fled to the Union Army. And it was a Vermonter in New Orleans who sort of kicked that off. Okay, but then, we're getting into our next period of history here. Civil War ends. Everybody should read W.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, best book I've read on the Civil War. But because usually the Civil War, like you usually just say Gettysburg and now it's all over. They don't really say what happened then. But it's like actually that's what we got to know, what happened right after the last battle. And I'll use Lincoln's words, one of Lincoln's last speeches. He said, "I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow, and the power of money will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until all wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed."
What year was that?
Oh, that's a good question, and it's going to be like 1866 or something. Someone else check that for me. Thank you. This word robber barons, it has a particular weighted history, but I'm going to sort of place it a little earlier just in context. The pattern of, before Rockefeller and Carnegie got here, the pattern of pillage started a little bit earlier, and we can just begin talking about that ecologically. The first European settlers totally clear-cut the whole state. Old-growth forests of green mountains were exported as potash. The elegant equilibrium, which had been here for 10,000 years with the Wabanaki Confederacy, was torn to shreds, first by the fur trade and then by this extractive subsistence agriculture. Also, it's important to say that the early independent Vermont, never recognized any of the land claims of the Abenaki. There's some books over here, the Vermont Governor and Council, these big records of serious Vermont historians spend more time with these than I did. But I found in 1798, they recorded, somebody came and made an appeal to recognize the, early Vermont legislator and said, one of the quotes I got from this is, "We would now speak a few words to the honorable representatives of the people of Vermont. Yes, brethren, we believe it belongs to us, and we shall claim it as long as the sun rolls from the east to the west." In the 1830s, there was this thing called the Indian Removal Act. which culminated most famously in the Trail of Tears and the Cherokee. And this had a big effect on the people who lived here of indigenous descent. They didn't want the same thing to happen to them, so many of them sort of went into hiding and didn't necessarily leave the state, just living here, but they were basically trying to blend in rather than meet the same fate. This was also caused by a major eugenics program in Vermont. The numbers, I think the official numbers on paper is like over 200 people, but I think I've heard people say thousands of people were sterilized in a massive eugenics campaign. There's a book called Breeding Better Vermonters. Eugenics was a very popular movement in the United States before the Nazis made it unpopular. Okay, so we're getting up to the robber barons here. 1810, the last lot of Vermont has been apportioned. In 1825, the Erie Canal opens, and suddenly, like, Vermont now, this is a huge deal because now you can take shipment of, you can take goods, sheep, wool, everything from the Midwest, and you can come up here down the Hudson and go sell it to Europe. So suddenly, Vermont farmers henceforward have been in competition with all the Midwestern farmers. So that was a big deal. 1830s was, they call, like, peak self-sufficiency, maybe. Again, not talking about, this was, this was really peak self-sufficiency back here, but, deforestation continues. In 1870s, Burlington was one of the lumber capitals of the whole country. By 1880, the forest is at an all-time low. What's left of those forests is cut down to make pasture for sheep. In 1840, there's 6 sheep for every person. But again, when the Erie Canal comes in, that dries up because then they have to compete with all the Midwestern farmers. Sheep is just way larger quantities. Price goes way down. By 1850s, almost all the beaver are gone. In 1881, the last... Also in this period, Vermont loses about half of its human population, more than any other state in that period. This was known as the Great Emigration, and basically they left to find work somewhere else, in factories in the South or in the West. There's some oral history somebody recorded saying the only place that's growing is the cemetery. So in the aftermath of the Civil War, what Lincoln feared came to pass. Corporations were enthroned and robber barons were born. Vermont, because of its geology and geography, was spared, massive industrialization because the land's not really as good for it. There was in Windsor, you can go to the American Precision Museum. There is sort of an important industrial history in Vermont, but it's mostly like artisanal, high precision, high machine tooling. It's not like massive factories. As farmers left, miners were brought in. Corporate mine owners brought in thousands of new workers, Scots, Italians, Scandinavians, Spanish, English, Welsh, Irish, Greeks, and French Canadians all came to Vermont to work in the mines. Just name a couple. The Vermont Marble Company in Rutland, owned by Redfield Proctor, very colorful character, ran Rutland like a medieval fiefdom, would not tolerate unions. He was also active in the Spanish-American War and helped in imperial ventures in South America. And it was when workers went on strike, it was like war, and bridges were blown up and picket lines were broken up by machine guns, serious industrial disputes. But there's a bigger one kind of in Vershire in 1883, known as the Vershire Riot. The miners went on strike, occupied and seized the contents of the company store and took control of the town. They kidnapped one of the ex-governors, and they had all the mine powder, so they had massive explosives, and threatened to blow everything up if they weren't paid their back wages. The National Guard was brought in, and the governor ordered that the tills of the company be emptied of every dollar of cash and give them what they want. So this an early example of direct action getting the goods. But even more than this, the mining, what Vermont's most known for is granite, and we're most talking about Barry, Vermont. Granite mine started in Barry in the early 1800s. It's been called the greatest concentration of high-quality gray granite in the world by publicists from the Barry area. So it's millions of granite products from around the world. I'll just name a few famous things made of Vermont granite. The Robert Burns Memorial, the Louis Armstrong Memorial, Rockefeller Center, exterior of the UN Secretariat building, the U.S. Supreme Court, Jefferson Memorial, Indiana State Capitol, and Hope Cemetery is considered one of the most beautiful cemeteries in Vermont. A lot of the European artisans would sort of hone their craft on these graves of people who weren't super wealthy. There's these really nice examples of early marble carving in Hope Cemetery there. At first they worked by hand, but then they invented a pneumatic drill, which made the work faster and also accelerated the amount of dust they were consuming and gave them all silicosis or white lung disease. Bad working conditions and low wages led workers to organize radical actions. In 1886, the same year as the Haymarket Affair in Chicago, where we get May Day. People in America don't know so much about May Day, even though we invented it, but it's very famous in the rest of the world. The Granite Cutters International Association was founded that year, and the headquarters of this international union was the Barrie Socialist Labor Hall, which is still there. It was shared by socialists, anarchists, very outspoken. Those not my words, their words. And they united in different actions. About a dozen strikes between 1890 and 1933. Visiting speakers to the Barrie Socialist Labor Hall included Eugene V. Debs, Norman Thomas, Mother Jones, Big Bill Haywood, Samuel Gompers, and Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman describes in her autobiography, Living My Life, a very colorful scene from Barrie, which I won't quote from you now, but it's very interesting. In 1912, the world-famous Lawrence textile strike in Massachusetts. It's an interesting story here. The radicals in Barrie in planning for this major strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts, the strikers sent their kids to go to homestays somewhere else so that kids would have somewhere to go while they're on strike. And Barrie was one of the places that they sent them. And there's this beautiful account of them arriving on the train and being divided into homestays while people sang Son Chi from Puccini's Tosca. Here I am.
And it wasn't in English.
Yeah,
No.
it wasn't in English, exactly. It was fully unionized in 1941, and to this day, Barrie's the only place in the country where the granite industry is fully unionized. Okay, so Industrial Revolution in Vermont, that's sort of what it looks like. But one of the things about the Industrial Revolution, whether it's in London or France, is it also spawns the tourist industry. Little known fact is that tourism is, an industry, a commodity created to provide an outlet for the need to escape from the world of commodities. Anyway, so it's around the same time, same thing is happening. In 1911, the Vermont Bureau of Publicity is formed. In response to the Great Emigration, Vermont begins to advertise itself as a location for vacations, spas, healthy living, second homes, and healthy food. It was the first state to do this.
Sorry, when was this again?
1911.
Thank you.
The first state to now everybody does it, but they were the first state to advertise for itself, and this was the origin of the Vermont brand, which still they even say today that if you put Vermont on the label, you can charge 10% more for it. So that's about 100 years of publicity working for us. And it worked. In the 1920s, the number of cars in Vermont tripled. By the 1930s, less than 10% of Vermont farms are self-sufficient. Also in this period, I have to decide to discuss the main industry of our state. This is where the dairy industry gets started. So cows replaced sheep. Wool industry gives way to dairy industry. But like the wool market before it, Vermont dairy timers had a hard time competing with huge factory farms in the Midwest. There were about 11,000 farms in 1947, dairy farms. Today there's less than 1,000. And they're bigger, get bigger or get out of town. Vermont produces, I'm going to skip ahead to the present day since we're on dairy. Vermont produces over 320 million gallons of milk per year. This accounts for 70% of Vermont's agricultural sales and requires 80% of Vermont's farmland. Vermont is the state with the highest dependence on a single commodity. 6,000 jobs. About 1,500 of these workers are immigrants, about 90% of whom are undocumented. Today, Vermont produces about 20 times as much milk as it drinks, but only 1/20th of the food that it eats. About 80,000 Vermonters are food insecure. So, sorry, I keep jumping in and out of the timeline here, but feels like that's the right time to bring that up. Sort of back to our robber baron timeline here. We're getting up to the present day. Thanks for your patience, guys. 1950s, the Red Scare comes to Vermont. Alex Novikov is fired from UVM, along with thousands of other people whose lives are ruined because of the McCarthy anti-communist witch hunt. But there was also resistance. The United Electric Workers was one of the only unions in the United States that refused to sign the anti-communist pledge. They didn't lose a single shop in Vermont. And there were many Vermont newspapers that were very challenging of McCarthy, sort of standing out in the nation about that period. 1972, Vermont Yankee, they build a nuclear reactor, 540 megawatts, gives us at least 200,000 years of toxic waste to the Green Mountains, and a lot of it's actually in Texas. Bernie made a deal to send a lot of it to Texas. It malfunctioned almost right away. Over 100 abnormal occurrences within the first 4 years. The Vermont Senate voted to close it in 2012. It was overruled by courts. Continued protests shut it down around 2014. But the tritium in the Connecticut River will poison all our relations for hundreds of generations to come. Or maybe it's all fine and we can just keep like holding our cell phones next to our heads too, and there won't be any effect, folks. It's all good. By the 1990s, wolves were extinct. And so Vermont races into the 20th century, welcoming many new residents and leaving many others behind. In the 1960s, a lot of them people come up, including people here today and descendants of them, including myself. I'm a little later, and they would become known as Flatlanders. In this period, to accommodate the increased traffic, Vermont begins construction of I-91. I just want to take a little brief aside here to talk about I-91. In the town of Ascutney, the highway was planned to go right through the farm of Romaine Tenney. Romaine was one of the last of his kind, a dairy farmer who lived without electricity and didn't own a tractor or a car. Despite his protests, Tenney's farm was seized under eminent domain. Senator George Aiken said, "We're on the verge of the greatest development Vermont has ever seen." A few days later, Tenney let all his animals free, went inside, and burned down his house, ending his own life. Romaine Tenney was a martyr of progress, and he kind of represents the whole lost generation of Vermonters who are heirs to a legacy of independence whose currency has really lost all value in the 20th century.
Don't forget that he also let his dogs out.
Yeah, let his animals out first. Sorry, yeah.
In honor of,
Yeah, we got a dog in the house. Thank you. Thank you. Another person like that was Joe Ranger, and there's some people here who live on the road named after him today. He was a resident of North Pomfret. His mom barely escaped sterilization. He worked for his neighbors and on a poor farm, but he never got electricity or running water. He never owned a car or a tractor. He let his horse pasture wherever it wanted. He talked to the beavers, and he let the bees make a hive inside his home. His biographer writes, "Joe's pond has been bulldozed away, the beaver evicted, and rows of condominiums now surround a neat pond. The paved road is called Joe Ranger Drive." So I just want to tip my hat to these radical Vermonters who were sacrificed for progress, but whose memory is not lost yet.
Joe Ranger Road is not paved.
No, but there is a paved thing called Joe Ranger. Maybe I'm wrong on it. No, Joe Ranger Road is not, but the spot, isn't there a paved spot where his house was?
No.
his house
Okay.
is
Well, excuse me then.
stone foundation.
Okay. That's a quote from a guy who did a really detailed biography of him, but I don't know.
Well,
Could-
yeah, but he was from downtown West Hartford. I mean,
Okay, he does it now. Okay, there we go. Thank you.
I love Cameron dearly, but damn.
Okay, thank you.
Flatlander.
Flatlander, all right.
I can say that because he's not here.
Yeah. So this sort of takes us up to where we are, which I would call neoliberal Vermont. Neoliberal Vermont is split between the uphillers and the downhillers. Uphill are the professionals with capital, connections to cosmopolitan cities, and downhill are what's left of the rural people, isolated and forgotten, mowing the lawns of the second homeowners. Over the last century, the Vermont upper class moved from the town centers in the valleys to the old farmhouses on the hilltops, and Vermont's underclass moved from the tar paper shacks in the mountains to mobile homes in the floodplains. What's going on right now? So in terms of the economy, Ron Miller, local Vermont historian, he's got a quote in his book, Most Likely to Secede. He says, in terms of its resources, Vermont resembles an economic colony more than a sovereign state, a banana republic without the bananas. Our major minerals are owned by foreign corporations, our groundwater is exported by out-of-state bottling companies, and our hydropower resources are owned by TransCanada. Windsor County has about 20%, the birthplace of Vermont, Windsor County, about 20% of children under 6 live in poverty, and there's about 1,000 homeless youth in Vermont. So that's our economy. It's also booming in terms of coffee shops and trendy things. So that goes on. In terms of environment, Vermont is seen by the rest of the country as a model for environmental stewardship, but it's hardly the case, really. And energy expenditure in Vermont is one of the highest and most wasteful in the nation. If you're going to pick one thing, I guess you could talk about the pollution of Lake Champlain by fertilizers and pesticides. It's at near catastrophic levels. In 2015, the annual maximum phosphorus load in Lake Champlain was exceeded by over 345 tons, so if they're agricultural runoff. Even though Vermont's not industrialized, the trade winds carry acid rain from across the country into here. And there's a mass extinction in Vermont. Their ecological mass extinction that we're living through has something here too. The white-nose bat syndrome, which is devastating bats in the whole region, has its epicenter in Dorset, Vermont. So we might think Vermont is small, but as George Perkins Marsh said, there are no trifles. Nothing is small in nature. We can never know how wide a circle of disturbance we produce in the harmonies of nature when we throw the smallest pebble into the ocean of organic life. And the vengeance of nature for the violation of her harmonies, though slow, is sure. That's from George Perkins Marsh. And then in terms of society, what's neoliberal Vermont like? 11% of Vermont workers have unions. Let's see, Vermont, second whitest state in the union, has more African Americans in jail per capita than any other state except for Iowa. James Howard Kunstler said, a good traditional Vermont town is a strip mall with a candle shop in it. Less than half of Vermont students are proficient in science. Half of Vermont students are below the basic standards of literacy. But with more wealthy flatlanders moving in from out of state, property taxes go up and older Vermonters are forced to leave. So rural gentrification is very much underway, depopulating the countryside and filling it up with empty second home mansions. People probably already know about the opioid crisis. Just like the crack epidemic destroyed inner cities in the 1980s, the effect on rural Vermont is devastating. I don't really have the latest statistics. I think over 100 people a year, I think.
240, I think.
240 a year? Last year.
Better.
Okay.
A lot better, I guess.
Vermont has about 2 to 3 suicides per week. And for every suicide death, there are 30 attempts. Second leading cause of death for ages 15 to 35. But the perfect symbol, I believe, for neoliberal Vermont is the F-35 airplane. Supported by Patrick Leahy, by Welch, and by Bernie Sanders. This gruesome war machine is ironically and poignantly piloted by the Green Mountain Boys of the Vermont Air National Guard at the military base outside of Burlington. Each F-35 costs over $300 million. If people aren't familiar, it's like if you take a little kid and you say, like, I want to put all the weapons on one plane, Daddy. Like, that's kind of what the F-35 is. It's just this sort of gruesome spectacle of, like, techno wizardry.
It carries a nuke bomb.
And yeah, there we go. Yeah, they cost $300 million. The roar of their engines deafens local, crazy loud, and to say nothing of their purpose, which is mass death and destruction. So let's all bring this home to Woodstock, Vermont, which may in some ways be an example of neoliberal Vermont. I was noticing during the leaf season a lot of people going and looking at what it says on the little historical marker on the green. And town is home to J.P. Marsh, environmentalists, Frederick Billings, railroad empire builder, and Lawrence Rockefeller, conservationist and philanthropist. So let's just like unpack that a little bit. So George Perkins Marsh, it's worth talking about him a little bit. Wallace Stegner said he was critic at the time. He said that this book was the rudest kick in the face of American initiative, optimism, and carelessness had yet received. Most people don't, even though they sell it there, it's sort of safe because people don't read books. But if you actually read this book, he has a lot to say. And he's an interesting guy. He was born in Woodstock on the edge of an interminable forest. That's how he described it. Man and Nature. So he was born in Woodstock at the middle of a big forest and saw it all cut down. He bred sheep, he ran a woolen mill, built roads and bridges, sold lumber, speculated in land, chartered a bank, mined a marble quarry, but was also totally an intellectual. He read 20 languages. In the House of Representatives, he opposed the extension of slavery, opposed the Mexican War, and then he lived abroad for a long time. He traveled, Turkey, Egypt, Palestine, Italy. When he came back home, he found that his wool mill had failed, his Burlington business partners had betrayed him, the Vermont Central Railroad stole his land and squandered his investment. And this is interesting. He was Vermont Railroad Commissioner, and he suggested, quote, "A gallows car should be attached to every train and a director hanged at each trip." So he is like really angry at the railroad companies. Lincoln appointed him envoy to Italy and served there from 1861 to 1882, the longest term of any American diplomat. My personal private theory here is that they posted him abroad because they didn't want him around. And he was happy to go because the Vermont Railroad Company took his land and his economic ventures failed here. So I'm going to just read a quote from George Perkins Marsh, who we see his name every day in this town, but we don't often read his books. I'm going to force you to listen to it. Railroad surveys must be received with great caution. Joint stock companies have no souls. Their managers, in general, no consciences. In fact, every person conversant with the history of these enterprises knows that in their public statements, falsehood is the rule and truth the exception. More than one American state is literally governed by unprincipled corporations, which not only defy the legislative power, but have too often corrupted even the administration of justice. Anyway, I won't read the whole thing. He goes on, but it's a very radical book. I mean, he starts off talking about it's really a book about imperialism. The beginning of the book is all about the Roman Empire and how the Roman Empire clear-cut Europe. And then he's like, hey, look, we're doing this here now. And look, there's no, and so it's an ecological history with great detail of like scientific detail, but he often is reflecting on the social reality of it. So given this, what does it mean that we have a Marsh Billings Rockefeller Center? It's like kind of wild that these three names are all united in the afterlife. So on the one hand, with George Perkins Marsh, this is my best guess. What does this represent? With Marsh, we have the domestication of environmentalism. Take the radical environmentalist and sort of turn him into a milquetoast conservationist. We won't talk about his criticisms of empire or condemnations of the social injustices or anything like that. Let's just talk about how he's like an environmentalist. We greenwash the oil empire. So the descendant of the big oil fortune of the Rockefeller Company can be known as a philanthropist and conservationist, even though if we know about climate change or the history of oil exploration around the world, we know where this comes from. And then what about the railroads? It's like there's no railroad here anymore. So it's sort of it's like the rapture of the railroads. It's like now they've reached their apotheosis. We just love railroads, but they just aren't around anymore. Now we have highway lobbies. So all three of these characters come together in a national park, which is a dairy farm and tourism and a private mansion. So that's an empty private mansion, which the Rockefeller family can use anytime they want if they give them notice. So that's sort of the 21st century new look for the robber barons, I think. So there's your running start, guys, and there's the precipice, and now we got to leap. If you'll give me just a couple more minutes, I can. Can you mind giving me a couple more minutes? No. Okay. No. You don't mind. Okay.
We're leaping into wherever we're leaping to?
Exactly. Where are we gonna leap to next?
We're thinking of joining you in your movement.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Some of us are.
Okay.
I can't
Great.
speak for everyone.
what movement is it? Yeah. Yeah. Let's find clarity. There we go. So I'm just gonna, this last chapter of this story, which is now, I'm just gonna try to give you some inspirations for how we can navigate this precipice, social ecological precipice that we're on right now. And so hopefully the following things can give some military ideas, some social ideas, some economic development ideas, some anti-war ideas. But I'll begin with the Song of Vermonters by John Greenleaf Whittier. Come York or come Hampshire, come traitors or knaves, if ye rule o'er our land, you shall rule o'er our graves. Our vow is recorded, our banner unfurled. In the name of Vermont, we defy all the world. That's a Civil War anthem from Vermont. So there's a lot of people in Vermont who have just done crazy stuff. I can't say too much about this. I mean, one military thing was the Fenian Uprising. There was this whole mass movement of thousands of people that actually made war on Canada on behalf of the Irish to make a separate republic in the 1860s. So we can't talk about it, but people really made a big risk in it's just after the Civil War for Ireland. So I could look more into that history later, but it's worth mentioning because wild. The other thing fun to think about are the communes. So since the 18th century, Vermont has been a refuge for people who didn't really fit in elsewhere. The first commune was in Putney in 1848, directed by John Noyes. They practiced religious socialism. They had no private property, and they practiced what they called complex marriage. They considered traditional marriage to be equivalent to slavery. But this was not just a free-for-all, anybody does whatever they want. It was a very strictly regulated thing. You talk it out, honesty, God. I'm not the best historian on it. But they would allow their children to leave and go to school, and most of them would come back. So they were thrown out of Vermont because of their crazy opposition to monogamy. And they moved to, I think it was Oneida, New York. Oneida, thank you. But there were a lot of them. That was just the first. In Prohibition, there were a lot of them too, because people like Smuggler's Notch, that was a whole area. People, there was there was a whole thing they called small, noisy utopias. These little temporary autonomous zones, in the language of Hakim Bey, anarchist philosopher. Anyway, I could just name some communes: the Red Clover Commune, the Wooden Shoe Commune, Quarry Hill, Packers Corners, Irving Fisher's Commune, the Free Farm. There was one commune called Free Vermont, which famously made safe houses for Black Panthers and helped them get to Quebec. They were eventually raided too many times by the FBI and lost their way. Okay, another story for you that can give us some hope. The Green Mountain Highway. People familiar with the Green? In the 1930s, there was a highway that was going to run right along the crest of the Green Mountains. It was designed by Colonel William Wilgus, the guy who designed Grand Central Station, the Holland Tunnel, and righted the columns on the Parthenons in Athens. So you couldn't get a better guy to do it, right? It was part of the New Deal. The Green Mountain Parkway, it was going to run over Killington, over Camel's Hump, and over Mount Mansfield before reaching the Canadian border. And it had major political, financial, and journalistic support. And on town meeting day, to the surprise of many, it was defeated. 58 to 42% margin. So how did that happen? Town meetings, okay? The defeat of big developers with political friends in high places by small-town Vermonters could only happen thanks to the political system that still remained in place from the early days of the early Vermont settlers' town meetings. Alexis de Tocqueville, famous French commentator who wrote about this, he said that local assemblies of citizens constitute the strength of free nations. Town meetings are to liberty what elementary schools are to science. They bring it within the people's reach. And there's an even nicer quote I like from the Vermont movie, Sidney Lee. If people haven't seen the Vermont movie, by the way, it's great. It's 4 hours long, really detailed. Sidney Lee says, happily, the town meeting ethos grants every denizen, no matter how lowly he or she may appear to self-styled sophisticates, the utter freedom to tell their adversaries to go to hell. That's a precious right. In 1960...
Good food.
And it's good food, there we go. Depending on the town, maybe some have better than others. Yeah. No food in Woodstock. Used to. Okay. Yeah, you have a new resolution about this. There we go. There we go. Nice.
I still have a little lost here. Go to hell for good food?
Sorry? Yeah, there we go. In 1968, they voted again, no billboards in Vermont. So that's another town meeting, thanks to town meetings. Another thing town meetings have been good about is taking some expression themselves against war. In the 1980s, Vermont was a huge hub in the anti-nuclear movement. Vermont led a children's campaign for nuclear disarmament. In 1981, 2,000 people came to protest, and over 600 participated in a symbolic march from Washington, Vermont to Moscow, Vermont, which is kind of fun that we've got Washington and Moscow in Vermont. In 1982, 200 towns voted to support a nuclear freeze. In 2005, 52 towns and cities in Vermont passed resolutions concerning the war in Iraq. They passed different kinds of resolutions, but in general, they were all critical, demanding more oversight, and denying the president ability to just declare war without consultation or approval of Congress. So those are all things we could follow in their footsteps in obvious ways.
Did a lot of good, didn't it?
Didn't Brattleboro say declare Dick Cheney a war criminal, and if it comes to he will be arrested?
Real nice. There we go. Something. One thing I can't get away with not mentioning this, even though it's not taken seriously, is the idea of secession. Ron Miller, the local historian, sort of wrote the best book about this. It's called The Most Likely to Secede. What makes Vermont secession different from the other secession movements in the United States is its political orientation. So a lot of the other states want secession for what we might consider less progressive reasons, for not having to pay taxes for, public schools, or for potentially racist reasons. There's a lot of different secession movements. Vermont secession is sort of more dominated, and the people who've been advocating it by an anti-imperial, anti-war, pro-human rights, pro-women's rights, pro-equality ethos. There's some very famous people have supported the idea, including John Kenneth Galbraith, big, heavy-duty, power elite George Kennan, Kirkpatrick Sale, local author Ron Miller, recently deceased political prisoner Russell Maroon Shoatz. In 2007, a survey conducted by Center for Rural Studies at UVM found that 13% of eligible voters in Vermont supported secession, which is maybe, just a little less than the number of people who supported, the percentage of people that supported independence from Britain. So but you brought it up to tell a little more of the history, like why did they come to Vermont? This is relevant after the recent pandemic. One of the reasons they was thrown out of the towns in Massachusetts and Connecticut was he was advocating about the germ theory of disease, and that was like heresy. So to your point about his religious ideas. So this, what about with Radical Vermont? We're in a bookstore, so there's a history of radical books in Vermont. And the first is Ethan Allen's. He wrote the first anti-Christian book ever published in the United States. It's called Reason, the Only Oracle of Man. And it's not anti-Christian, and it's sort of deism, but it's not exactly deism. It's sort of his own take on it. And it was written a decade before Thomas Paine's book, The Age of Reason. And most copies were burned. People really didn't like this. He considered it his greatest accomplishment and biggest contribution. It's sort of a difficult read in the sense that books from the 1770s are difficult to read. But it's very interesting, and he's basically telling you to go out into nature, and that's where you're going to find God, not in the Bible. And the Bible is a bit some parts of it anyway are sort of crazy to read them today. It doesn't make much sense, like Noah's Ark. A lot of it is going through the Bible and trying to did this really happen like this? But in general, he's telling people to go use their own reason in nature and find God that way. That's it. Another one, this is, less illustrious politically, but important to know. Rudyard Kipling wrote some of his most famous books in Vermont, including The Jungle Book, Seven Seas, Captains Courageous. Dorothy Thompson and Sinclair Lewis, both radical writers. It Can't Happen Here was written in Vermont. Dodsworth. Thompson was considered one of the most influential women in the United States. She's buried in Barnard. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Russian dissident, wrote The Red Wheel in Vermont, lived here for 20 years in Cavendish. And the radical anti-capitalist theorist Murray Bookchin made his home in Vermont, started the Institute of Social Ecology. All these people have sort of have big footprints around the world. So early decades of the 21st century, we have some great radical community organizing that's happened in this state. From getting civil unions for same-sex couples to winning the healthcare as a human right campaign by the Vermont Workers' Center to change legislation around healthcare. In 2014, there was a fantastic campaign about GMOs, trying to get all GMO products labeled. It was a big victory that was then overturned in courts, but still at the forefront of this struggle in the United States. Migrant Justice is a group that's won a lot of important victories in the states to defend immigrants here. I would call your attention, in 2012, the Vermont Workers' Center gathered this big assembly and created the Vermont Declaration of Human Rights. So I'd encourage everybody to look at that. I don't know how many people read it, but it's this very radical document that was written collectively. So it's not just like some wise people wrote it and then other people ratify it. It's very like a democratically written document. And then in 2017, pressured by activists in the town of Woodstock, the Vermont legislature passed a resolution designating October 16th as John Brown Day. Yeah, exactly. This is my visual aid here. John Brown, by the way, his body came through Vermont. I left this out. After the Civil War, his body came through Vermont, through Vergennes, through Rutland, went to North Elba, and they couldn't find this guy who'd been a devout Christian his entire life. They couldn't find a pastor to preside at his funeral. And the only one who would take the job was this guy in Burlington. Very important stuff. I found the guy's name, Joshua Young. And guys, thank you so much for your patience. We're going to wrap up here, but I really appreciate your staying power here. Joshua Young was the only person willing to preside at John Brown's funeral. And this goes back to the Underground Railroad because he completely ruined his career. All the people, everybody basically left his church when he came home to Burlington, and he had to resign.
Fulton Harper's Ferry, he's not one of their favorite people.
That's right. Okay, so now I'm going to wind up here as fast as I can. Back to where we began, to Dawnland. In 1991, the state of Vermont celebrated its bicentennial, leaving out 99% of its human history. But the descendants of the Wabanaki Confederacy in Vermont and the wider bioregion of Dawnland are very active, and they're rising. Oh no, I lost a page here. Well, I could give you sort of the blow-by-blow of all the different fish-ins, but basically just to say, coinciding with the American Indian movement, different groups of Abenaki activists and elders, cultural activists, economic activists, social activists have been very visible, very active, very organized. And this sort of culminates in 2006 when the Vermont legislature recognizes for the first time that there are Abenaki people living in the states. And I'm going to end on this note because it's sort of a schizophrenia or a bipolar recognition, because it says we see you, but you don't exist because you're not you have no rights we're bound to recognize, but we recognize you're there. You're not a tribal, entity, but you exist. And so that's sort of how I think it's a good way to wrap up the talk, because where are we at right now? We're sort of one eye open, one eye closed, sort of amnesiac. Vermont's a bit like that. So we have, on the one hand, we're wide awake, like more than a lot of other people in the country maybe sometimes. And the other way, we're fast asleep still. And we should open both eyes to leap over the precipice ahead of us. And that's something that you're not going to get from a wise man or a young person. That's something we're going to find out together in community. And people are going to have great ideas, but in terms of what we're going to do together, that's the conversation. So thank you very much.